Hello, I'm Adrian Ashton, and welcome to this video session about governance, particularly governance in a charity, and even more particular than that, codes of governance, the kind of the secret ciphers that might help you unpick and understand how we actually reconcile all of these different facets of governance and responsibilities and assumptions and expectations together in your role as a trustee or as a trustee to be, or you may be watching this as a trustee who's simply wanting to do a quick refresher, make sure that you've not forgotten anything and that you are up to date with everything. So in this session, we're looking at the Charity Sector Code of Governance. Now, if you've watched some of the other videos in this series, you'll be aware that this is a document which was created by the sector for the sector. It was not imposed upon us as charities by the Charity Commission or by government. It emerged through a series of conversations several years ago between leading sector bodies such as NCBO, Akiro, Barrow Cadbury Trust as one of the key strategic funders to the sector and others, and the Charity Commission. So previous years, the Charity Commission had produced a document called The Hallmarks of an Effective Charity, which is the charity sector as the regulator saying, this is what we think a well-run charity would look like. These would be the marks that it's doing a good job. And in the main, the charity sector said, okay, fair enough, this is a good start. But then again, you know, as we said, are some of the sector bodies, some of those representative entities said, but it's missing a bit. It's not really, how can it be about us? How can it be for us if it wasn't with us, if we weren't involved in leading it? So there was an initiative, a program, which looked at how do we create a governance code, a checklist, a framework that works for us as charities. So they spent a bit of time developing this, went through consultation, came up with a charity governance code. And that's great. And it was so good, in fact, that the Charity Commission said, you know what, we'll scrap our hallmarks document and we'll recommend this instead, because this is actually bob on. This is on the money. This is really how it should always have been. So, you know, pretty good endorsement in terms of a framework there. Now, the other thing I think it's worth mentioning, if you can see this on the screen, is the date stamp on this document as well, which says 2019. Now, that's because, as with all governance codes, as with all pieces of legislation, as with all frameworks, they are subject to a regular review. Every few years, the sector sits down and it says, what's changed? What's changed in the wider world? What's changed in legislation? What's changed in society? What's changed in our communities, the way we work, the way everything runs? And in light of all that, are these principles, is this framework still relevant and current? And if it isn't, we'll update it. So it's always worth checking if you're using the Charity Governance Code, as with any document, check the version number and the date stamp on the cover. So the code we're looking at in this session is the code of 2019. Now we're recording this session towards the end of autumn winter of 2020. And at the moment, at the time we're recording this, the code is going through one of its regular reviews. So it may be that by the time you come to watch this video, at a future induction or training session, there's a slightly different version of this document in your shared folder, in your induction pack. And if that's the case, that's fine, but that's why. But the broad shape of it will still be the same. Now, there's a second thing on this image as well I wanted to highlight, to explain, to pick out. And the more eagle-eyed amongst you may have spotted this already. It says the governance code, and then in smaller letters, for larger charities. Now, that's because as the sector, the charity sector, we came together, we said, we recognize we are a very broad church. There's all sorts of different types of charities that go on within us. And the Charity Commission recognizes this because the Charity Commission says, depending how large you are as a charity, that informs how much rigor should be applied to the examination and validation and auditing of your annual accounts. So the Charity Code recognizes that and mirrors it and says, so if you're a larger charity or if you're a smaller charity, okay, so there's two versions for governance code for small charities and for large charities. And the cut-off point in the middle is currently about £1 million. So if your turnover is about £1 million, then that's the tipping point that says you should move to the larger version. Otherwise, for nearly all charities in the sector, it's the smaller one that we use instead. And the difference between them isn't that great. The difference is in some of the detail of how it's applied, but we'll come to that in a few moments. What I wanted to share first, though, was about, well, what's the point of this code? Why is it we might need it? What's the point? Well, it's not. Let's start with what it's not. It is not a legal requirement to adopt the code. The code is a voluntary set of principles. The code is not a requirement that you have to have in order to meet quality management standards, but it can help. The code instead is a framework that reconciles the legal roles and responsibilities with who you are as trustees. It reconciles the expectations that partner organizations, beneficiaries, wider communities and the public, regulators and others have on you as trustees in a charity. And then it also reconciles that third element, which is the charity's own governing document, its constitutional rules and how it's set out, how it's going to work itself. It's set out how its internal practices work. Now, all of those three elements are subject to different pressures over time. And at different times, those three elements will become more or less important in relevance to each other as well. So the idea of the governance code is to offer a framework that allows the charity to make sure it is continuously improving, that it doesn't get stayed, it doesn't get complacent. It's always having that prompt to say, is how we're doing things still correct? Is it still the best way for us to be working as a charity in terms of our community, in terms of the people we have as trustees, and in terms of our resources that we have available to us? Okay, so it's kind of a reassurance checklist in that way. It's based on certain assumptions, one of which is that you're already ticking all the boxes in terms of what the law says you should be doing. Okay, that's the starting point. You are legally compliant with the basic requirements of charity law, any employment law, any safeguarding laws that are relevant to what you're doing and your services, and it builds on those. It goes beyond what's required as basic minimum. It's framework, I said it's a framework, so it's based on principles. It doesn't say you must do this, you must do that. The essential trustee document, if you've already sort of watched that video in this series, talks about the Commission says you must do this as a trustee and you should do this as a trustee. The Charity Code of Governance is much more flexible and says these are the principles, this is the point of how it should be, and these are the ways that it may help you to make sure it's happening. It sets out some checklists of sort of measures, policies, procedures against each of those. And it's also quite human in some ways, because it's, look, you're not going to be perfect. There may be parts of this code that, for whatever reason, you just can't do. They may not be relevant to your work. It may be that you've decided to introduce the code in stages. So in terms of managing those expectations and relationships with external parties, the Commission, funders, beneficiaries, partner organizations, when you're going out and saying, yes, we are adopting the governance code, you can be very clear as well that says we are adopting the governance code, but not these parts of it, because. And you explain why those parts aren't relevant. Okay, so it's, again, sounds pretty common sense, pretty straightforward. So this is the kind of the world that exists in terms of the governance code. It's meant to be flexible. It's meant to be most used to you as an individual charity, because it's been written by other charities in consultation with other charities. And it's there to support you, to make sure, yes, we are confident as trustees that we are on top of everything, that we're focusing on the right things, the relationships are working properly. And because we've adopted the code, we can evidence that, we can give that assurance to other people as well. So that's the point of where it is. Now, the other thing about the governance code that I quite like personally is it's got some pictures in it, it's got some charts. Most other governance documents that you will come across and be introduced to, I'm afraid, are a bit dull and boring. Just blocks of text, maybe a subheading, maybe if you're looking, you're lucky, some bold sections, a bit of italics. But in the main, it's just flows of text. The governance code is a bit different. So it gives this nice chart, this nice image as a visual representation of what the governance code is all about. And I think this is useful because it allows us to make sense of, okay, so this is how it all fits together. What's the point of each aspect of the code? How do they interrelate to each other? Well, first at the bottom, you'll see the foundation. So if we imagine the charity is a building, okay, or some kind of forward moving vehicle, the foundation, the bedrock, what's the principles that it's based on? Well, that's what you are as trustees. You are those trustees. You are the bedrock of this charity. Okay, trust you as trustees with the charity's governing document. That's the starting point for everything. And then there are a number of pillars, a number of themes, and governance code says there are 7 of these themes to work through. And in the course of this video, we'll look briefly at each of these and what it might mean for you in practice. But ultimately, at the apex of all of that, holding it all together, creating that focus for how to apply these pillars, how to shape them, is the purpose of the charity. What are its charitable objects? What are its aims? What are its purposes? If you're clear about those as well, then approaching each of these pillars in turn makes much more sense. And it's much easier because you know what you need from each pillar. You can look at each of those and go, okay, well, in terms of board effectiveness and measures and performance, what should we be looking at? What should we be monitoring? What should we be seeing as reporting in the context of the charity's purpose, rather than what other people think might be important? Because underpinning that is you as a trustee, you need to make sure that as a trustee, public benefit is being achieved. Okay, so that's the kind of the way it flows through. So let's have a look at some of these in a bit more detail. First of all, principle number 1, the charity's purpose. Now, again, going through this, it may sound a bit familiar, a bit of deja vu if you've watched some of the other videos in these series. And that's because, again, the code is here to try and unify and integrate all of these different aspects together. It's not here to introduce new stuff. It's here to try and make your life as trustees a bit easier, making sense of it all. So the principle is that you as trustees, individually and collectively, know and can say what the charity is there to do. You know what it is, says on the tin that it's about, and you're confident it's able to do that. It's working in practice. So that's the principle. That seems fair enough. How would you know it's working? How would you know, though, that the charity is achieving that? So the code talks about outcomes. What things would we see that we would have confidence are happening? So the outcomes for this say that the trustees have a shared purpose, that as trustees, you can say collectively and individually, this is what our charity is set up to do, and here are some examples. Here are the numbers, here are the lists that show it's achieving that. Okay, so in terms of outcomes, and then what the code does in terms of smaller charities and large charities, it then goes down to offer a checklist of suggested practices that would help the charity assure itself that those outcomes were being achieved, that it is able to evidence that. And again, the difference is when a larger charity, the £1 million plus charities, that list of suggested recommended actions and practices is more detailed and goes into more depth than for smaller charities. Because if you're a larger charity, you should have a better handle on things. There's more stuff going on. There's more responsibility. There's bigger things happening. So it's a proportionate approach. The second theme is about leadership. I think this is a really important one to focus on because I have an idea that leadership is very often confused with management, and they're not the same thing. However, there will be times when managers need to act as leaders, and there may be times when leaders, conversely, need to act as managers, but they are very separate things. Managers are responsible for making sure stuff happens. You're given a job, you chunk it up into tasks, you make sure the tasks are done, you achieve the goal. Leadership is saying, what should those goals be? And what's the way that we should approach achieving them? Not working out what the tasks are, not micromanaging to that level. The principle of leadership here, as defined in the code, is it's about being strategic, that bigger picture stuff, not the day-to-day operations. And important as well in terms of leadership, it's not just a tick box leadership, it's about authentic leadership. It's about being the best leaders you can be as trustees. And for that, that means how are you doing that strategic stuff in the context of the values of the charity? What are the charity's values? What's that kind of secret ingredients that say everything we do, these are the 3, 4, 5 things that underpin everything we do, that reflect our identity, our ethos, what makes us special, what we think is most important in this world, about how things should work and about how people should be treated and the opportunities they should have. So it's cultural identity as well, it's values and how that works. And the outcomes for that, again, it kind of, well, how do we know we'd be achieving that? Well, again, it's about you as trustees and saying, well, as trustees, we know that we stand together in making sure we deliver up on our purpose, that the purpose is being achieved, not the day-to-day detail. You know, we've managed to keep some jobs going, we've managed to put some courses on. How does that actually help with the charity's purpose of transforming a community or saving the squirrels or whatever it is your charity's purpose is? And ultimately as well as how are you as trustees making sure that the charity's culture, its ethos, its working practices, the way people feel when they come to engage with the charities, volunteers or workers or beneficiaries, that kind of that secret magic fairy dust that permeates everything. How do you make sure that culture is also working well? And this is for many organizations, not just charities, a really tricky one. And it may be something that as trustees, you think it may be useful to spend some additional time and resource investing in to get a good handle on that. And that could be through some specific additional training. It could be through some form of review or audit. It could be through some consultancy work, whatever it is. But again, it's up to you as trustees to work out how do you best make sure this is working for you. And again, there are recommended actions and practices against this principle in the code. And as with other documents that we talk about in these video sessions, there are copies of those documents, that code, which is available to you as an attached file in the kind of shared documents folder in the filing cabinet. Also within that is a checklist, an audit thing as well. So there is a Word document that the governance code has that comes with it as a supporting document, which is a way that you can do it, or you can task someone to do a quick ready reckoner, say, how well do we think we're actually doing this in practice? So a nice, again, quick practical way to set that forward. Principle number 3, integrity. And this is a bit of a strange one because you think, well, actually, we're charity trustees. We're regulated by the law and the Charity Commission. We have to create public benefit. We're not supposed to take personal gain from being a trustee. So we're always going to do that, aren't we? Well, this is the interesting thing. So this is where I think the Charity Governance Code is really important and is a clear step away from a lot of the other training and documents and checklists that you will come across. The principle says you should act with integrity. That means you should, the way that you should model the values, the culture, the ethos of the charity in how you act, in how you conduct your relationships with each other, internally and externally. The principle also says that as charity trustees, you are part of a wider community. Let's think about this. So you're part of a charity. Now, out there in the wider world, most people say, well, charities are charities. Regardless of if you're a big charity or a small charity, or you have 5 sites or 1 site, charities are charities, right? In the same way that supermarkets are supermarkets. So you actually have a responsibility on you as charity trustees of your charity to act in ways which are supportive of your peers, because how your peers are acting are reflecting on you in terms of how they're seen as trustees. So it's the idea that as trustees, you're not just there to uphold your charity, you are also there as representative of the wider charity sector and all other trustees everywhere as well. And that's an important aspect to your role that maybe doesn't get picked up enough elsewhere. But the governance code picks up on this. And it says you will benefit, your charity will benefit a lot from the goodwill that is created for the charity sector by other charities. And that only happens if you keep paying back as well. You keep doing your bit to maintain and build trust and ethos and reputation and credibility in the wider charities because of what you are doing and how you are behaving as well. And this is why integrity is so important and why the governance code makes a big thing of it. The outcomes are, how do you know you're acting with integrity? Well, you can show as trustees there's no funny business going on. Okay, conflicts of interest are being handled. No one's getting a backhand or an unfair advantage from being a trustee. You are acting to maintain and protect the reputation of the charity. If there are scandalous rumors circulating, if it looks like something might be going wrong, if it looks like someone's bringing a complaint, you know that there is a system in place to manage it equitably, fairly, openly, consistently. And again, it comes back to this point of your charity's values. How does that work in terms of what the charity's values are? And hopefully as trustees, as part of your induction, there should be a list somewhere or a document that says, this is our charity, this is our vision, this is our mission, these are our purposes, and these are our values. These are the ways that we start to model those values and put them into practice. Okay, so this has all been quite grandiose so far, kind of, stirring orchestral music, big pumping Hollywood soundtracks. And now I'm afraid we have to kind of step it down a bit. It gets a bit more mundane. Decision-making, how we hold meetings, how we manage risk, how you as trustees make sure that the charity is being sufficiently and appropriately controlled and managed in practice. It may be a bit lackluster in comparison with those other principles, but it is equally important. Okay, remember that diagram at the start. 7 pillars, all pillars are of equal size and importance. So the principle in terms of this element is that your decision-making process is when you come together to meet, when you think about things that need to be reviewed, when you think about actions that need to be taken, plans that need to be put in place, you've got a good system that works well. It's appropriate, it's robust, and it's fit for purpose. And how do you know that that's working in practice? How do you know you've got the right stuff? Well, again, we look down the side of that list and we say, well, what outcomes do we see? So we look at those minutes from the meetings, and if those minutes from the meetings are littered with references to day-to-day management, working hours, rotas, what color we should paint the storeroom, who's got the keys today, that's operational matters. That means you're kind of losing focus on where it should be, that the decision-making is not happening at the right level as it should be for trustees. You've also got a risk system in place as well. That could be a risk register, quite a simple document. But there's also a danger, there's a risk in managing risk, perversely, because as trustees, you have a responsibility to safeguard and protect the resources of the charity to deliver on its mission and its purposes. And it may be that we go through a period of recession. It may be that we go through a period of pandemic, as has been happening in 2020. As a result, we're quite nervous about running out of cash, running out of resources to be able to keep going. And the code is really explicit about this. It says we need to manage risks, absolutely, but as trustees, you should not be overly cautious, because the danger is that if you sit there and go, no, we better not spend that money just yet. We've got these reserves. We don't want to dip into them because we're saving them for a rainy day. Seems to be raining pretty hard right now. If the reserves are for a rainy day, it's a rainy day now. Well, why aren't we spending them now? Well, there might be another rainy day. Well, there will always be a rainy day at some point in the future. And it's a very fine balance as trustees that you need to work out to say, how far has your approach to risk and your risk registers actually stifled you in terms of being able to go out and keep doing stuff and be creative and create change and benefit? And also in terms of control and decision-making, that there are line management structures in place as well. Any staff who are employed, teams of volunteers, that are appropriate structures in place to make sure that those people are properly supported, those people are doing their roles well and effectively, and that everything's safe and it's on top. So it sounds a bit dull, a bit checklisty, but it's really important because this is the practical stuff of how the charity works, how it rolls forward. Number 5, this is about how you work as a board of trustees. How effective are you when you meet together, when you act together? It's what I sometimes call the playground rules. When we're back in school, we had these kind of weird agreements with our mates about how things would work at playtime. So this is essentially that updated to be a bit more professional and grown up and adult. So the principle is, as a board, as a body of trustees, you work together well. Okay, that's kind of it. And that not only you work together well, but all of your respective skills and expertise are there at the fore. For example, if one of you is an expert accountant, then depending on how you are working together as a body of trustees, that expert accountant is bringing their skill and knowledge and expertise to your decisions. They're involved, they help you as a body of trustees collectively understand the implications of setting different budgets, of understanding what story are these accounts telling. But there's a system in place to really harness that skill. So that's an effective board. That's not the same as doing a skills audit and saying, oh, we have a HR person, an accounts person, a marketing person on the board. So what? How do you know that their skills and expertise is able to be used, that they're able to share that for the benefit of the charity? So this is that difference. It's a difference between having the skills and being effective. And what the governance code focuses on is how effective you are, because you can always train to gain a skill. You can always invite people with a particular skill. What's important is how you work together. And the outcomes for that is signs that you have a healthy working relationship. And a healthy working relationship is not just about, oh, we all seem to get on okay together. A healthy working relationship is actually, we can challenge each other. We can call each other out on stuff. And we can do it in a way that means we can still work together afterwards. We can be constructive in how we do it. So there's something about how we interrupt, how we challenge each other happening well. There's something else in terms of as trustees, we have enough time. Like maybe that as you were recruited into your role as trustee, that part of that was a briefing, an induction, a job description, if you will, that says this is what's expected of you. And a lot of charities are starting to increasingly say, if you're going to be a trustee, we would expect, we anticipate that you will be able to devote at least this many hours a week, a month, a quarter, a year to do the role properly. So you have enough time to actually invest in those relationships to work together through things. In this theme as well, it also emphasizes and stresses the importance of the chair of trustees as well as a key role. And again, there's some specific guidance and recommendations in the codes that go behind that, but the chair is a focal point for the board. Okay. I often liken the chair to being a referee. Okay, they're there to make sure the rules are followed and to keep things to time and to make sure that if there's a disagreement, it's properly sorted out between people. Okay, so use it that way. That's the role of the chair. It's quite important to do that. And also importantly, you may recall from some of the other video sessions we've done in this series, if a board of trustees makes a decision, because trustees are legally collectively bound together, trustees have an equal shared responsibility, they stand together. So there's a system in place that says, if we make decisions, we can all live with them, even if we don't agree with them. Okay, and there's evidence of that working through as well. And that's how you can be sure that as a board, you are properly effective in working through as well. Okay, nearly there, 2 to go now. Well done, you're hanging in. Diversity. Now, this is often a difficult one because diversity is often seen as, oh, we must make sure we have a person of color on the board. We must make sure we have a person with lived experience on the board. We must make sure we have a person who is experiencing a type of disability on the board. And that gives us diversity. That's tokenistic diversity. What the code is interested in is how that diversity is actually relevant and appropriate to the charity. The principle it talks about is that the diversity that you create amongst you as a body of trustees enhances and supports how you work together as a body of trustees, how you make decisions, how you can lead the charity, how effective, all of those previous themes that we've been looking at in brief. How does that diversity help, and the outcomes are there to kind of support that. It says, well, because you recognize there's a body of trustees that the different views that these people bring, this representation brings, this diversity and inclusion brings, strengthens how you can work. It brings you different perspectives that you might not otherwise have considered or properly understood. And you don't just do it to the point that it's a legal checklist. It's fully embraced. It's a cultural approach. Okay? Back to one of those earlier themes about the culture, the values, the ethos of the charity, how it works in practice. And finally, the big finish, openness and accountability. Seems a bit dry, seems a bit odd, but again, this links back to all of those other themes as well. They're all kind of cross-mingle. As trustees, you are clear that the charity is open and accountable in how it does what it does. Okay, you are. Why is that a good thing? Why, stuff's happening, isn't it? Why do we need to know that? Well, the outcomes, I think, alongside this, are an indication of to why these are a good idea, as to why actually being open and accountable as trustees, as a charity, is a good idea for you to be thinking about. Because it means that the wider community, partner organizations, get it, get you, know why your charity is important and know why they should be working with you and why they should be supporting you. It also means that people trust you, and that trust rubs off into the wider sector as well. And it also means that when you are speaking, when you are acting, when you are delivering as a charity, that the communities whose voice you are sharing back you are mandated, you are seen as having been validated to speak on their behalf, to act in their interests. And that makes you more trustworthy and more credible to get out and achieve the purposes. So that's kind of it. That's the approach of the governance code, hopefully in comparison perhaps with some of the other governance aspects we've been looking at through this series, the essential trustees, the checklist of roles and responsibilities, the charity's governing document. It helps make sense of how they all weave together, of actually how this framework approach helps you make even better sense of them all and how they support each other, how the importance of each one allows you as trustees to make sure you have the confidence and the assurance you're doing the right thing, the right systems are in place, you're asking the right questions, and you're watching the right stuff. Okay, as it goes. Now, the other thing though about the Charity Governance Code, I think it's important to touch upon in this, is there's more than one. I said at the start, there's the Charity Code for smaller charities and larger charities, absolutely, but there's more than one governance code for charities out there. Okay? This is where it gets a bit confusing. Now, normally what tends to happen is those governance codes are split down into specific themes or activities. So, for example, there is a governance code if you are a faith-based charity. That, again, builds on and supplements these other things. There is a governance code for sports clubs that builds on and supplements these other things. So they're very specific. But the other one that I think may be relevant to introduce you to here was created by the NCVO, the National Council of Voluntary Organisations, in last year, so 2019, and like I said, we're recording this in 2020. And it's the Charity Ethical Principles. It's a light touch code of governance. And it may be that you say, well, actually, that Charity Governance Code is great, but it seems to be too big for us to start with. There's quite a lot going on there. We may be a young charity, we may be going through a big review. We don't want to get distracted by putting all this stuff in place when actually we need to be focusing on making sure we keep delivering against our public benefit. So the Charity Ethical Principles may be a useful starting point as a kind of light version, because this document only has 4 strands. Okay, so the governance code, 7 pillars, the foundations, and a purpose at the top. This document has only 4 themes, 4 points that it goes on. It's a much shorter document as well. And it says, number 1, your beneficiaries should come first. That's the ethical principle. The people the charity set up to support should be the focus for everything you do, in terms of making sure there's public benefit, you're delivering on your charity's aims. Okay? Seems straightforward. Number 2, the charity should be acting with integrity. Again, this is a kind of a lighter version. What that means is it's compliant with all the rules that's expected of it. Charity law, employment law if it employs people, safeguarding legislation as well, if it's volunteers are supporting its work, or it's engaging with children or other vulnerable adults. Number three, there should be openness. It should be open about what it does. It shouldn't be hiding what it does. And that's really important because that, again, it recognizes, it builds trust in the wider sector. And without trust, charities really struggle to deliver on what they need to do, because without trust, it's hard to create good, working, effective relationships with all sorts of different audiences and people. And finally, people have the right to be safe. And that's all people, not just people who come and benefit from what the charity does, but anyone it employs, anyone who comes to visit it, you as trustees, volunteers, and so on. Regardless of who those people are, everyone has an equal right to be protected and to feel safe in their lives. And that's it for ethical principles and considerations. And as you may see, as we've gone through those, they echo, or they future echo, that wider governance code. So it may be that as a charity, you decide, you know what, this is an easier starting point for us. This is more manageable. We'll start with these and then we'll build up over time. Because remember, that governance code, when I introduced it, the overarching principle, the ethos, the point of a governance code is to help the charity continuously improve. Not to say we've now arrived, we can start to get complacent, but it's an ongoing process. So maybe starting this way as well could be an interesting approach. That says we'll start with the smaller version, and then we'll build up to the larger governance code from that once we feel we've got comfortable and embedded this. But so what? Okay, governance code, so what? Sounds great, sounds like it could be useful, but so what? If you're going to adopt the governance code or the ethical principles or any other sort of framework to that matter, so what? What's the point? Because introducing the code, evidencing it, reviewing your systems and processes and policies around it will take time, will have a cost. And my argument is always, if you're going to do something like that, you should know why. You're going to spend time or money or other resources on something, you need to know why it's a good idea. So for you, my kind of challenge to you from this side of the video screen to yours is, if you're going to adopt the governance code or the ethical principles, what's the business case? What's the benefit to your charity of adopting that today? Now, if your charity has already adopted it, then go and check. Ask why did we adopt this? Why is this a good idea? Why did we think this was a good idea? Just as the codes are reviewed every few years, because things change in the wider world, so your charity, if it's adopted a governance code, should also review that decision every couple of years because of how things are changing in the wider world and within itself. Say, is this still appropriate for us? Or should we look at one of the other versions? Or should we just even bother having a code at all that we apply or explain why we don't with? And then going on from that, thinking about risk and governance is, if you do decide to adopt a code, or you already have, what might happen if all of a sudden something changed radically and you are no longer able, your charity is the trust, you as a trustee lost confidence that you couldn't show how you were adhering, you were applying that code and how the charity works. What might that mean? What risk does that attach? So again, because the governance codes themselves talk about recognizing risk, managing risk. Setting up, adopting this code puts yourself out there to say, we are holding ourselves to our higher standard of governance. That creates expectations in the relationships you have. So it's a risk if you suddenly can't adhere or uphold aspects of that code as well. So be aware of those and start to think about those. And again, as with the other videos we've done, these are prompts. These are not your mandated homework. These are a way that you can start to talk with your fellow trustees and other people about how you've understood this content, what it means in practice. And then also, when you then start to read through the supporting documents to these series as well, the governance codes themselves, the audit checklists for how well might we already be meeting that code, that can make better sense of it. So hopefully, again, as with all the other sessions that we do, there's been something in there that's been of an encouragement to you because you recognize that something that you're already doing. There's been a challenge as well in terms of making you think, oh, I hadn't really thought about that, and there's a really good thing there we need to work on. But ultimately, as with all of these things, that you now feel, even if only this much, you feel at least this much more comfortable and confident in your role as a trustee, individually and collectively as a wider board. Thanks for listening.